To Synagogue Tech Forum. My name is David Paskin, a Torah Tech guy, and oh my goodness, am I excited for today. We have a fantastic discussion today. Synagogue Tech Forum. My name is David Paskin, a Torah Tech guy, and there we go again. We're getting the feedback again. It's like every single time I do that, it just starts automatically. It's so annoying. I apologize. I am so excited for today's discussion because our guest was really 2 years ago was almost prophetically imagining the big questions that we were going to be talking about through this pandemic. I'm going to, in just a second, I'm just going to turn it over, but I just want to say, if you are watching us here in Zoom and you'd like to join us on the panel, just raise your hand. We'd be happy to have you. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or anywhere else, please say hello in the chat, throw some questions in there. We'd love to hear from you and include you in our little party here. So I'm going to go around. I'll start with David and Marty. We'll end with Tobias, and he can introduce our guests. So David, how you doing?
Hi, I'm great. Dave Kaufman calling in from Vancouver, BC, where the sun is finally coming out. Spring is coming. You know, Tu B'Shvat means the Shkedia Parachet, and we're looking forward to spring and return of more in-person things.
When I was in Boston, we used to sing, the almond tree is freezing, the golden sun is sneezing. If you think that this is spring, I could sell you anything. I don't know. Maybe that's just a Boston thing. All right. Marty, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. How you doing, David? Leo, welcome, Rabbi Lederman and David. And Tobias, yes. I'm here from Silver Spring, Maryland, where it was really cold this morning, like 17 degrees. Oh, my goodness.
Ouch.
Yeah. And you know, things are still kind of locked down because it's you know, here and there, it's up and down.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And Marty, what's your areas of expertise and interest?
Well, I am an audio video technologist. You know, I've been doing this for too many decades to mention, and I'm the host of the Hybrid Ministries Tech Forum, which runs on alternate Thursdays. And, you know, this is, it's wonderful to have the Synagogue Forum as our sister show. So absolutely.
You got it. Rabbi Moss, acclaimed singer, songwriter, geek. How you doing?
I prefer nerd to geek, but that's just a personal thing.
Fair enough.
So I'm Rabbi Tobias Moss. I'm in Minneapolis at Temple Israel here. Excuse me. And I'm really excited to welcome our featured guest for the show, Rabbi Esther Lederman, who I first connected with because we both were once fellows at B'nai Jeshurun in New York City. And so we first connected through that kind of alumni-ship. But then during the pandemic, when this one article got passed around the most, which was let's stop calling it, or not, in addition to calling things hybrid, let's call them multi-access, because that's kind of a broader vision for what this moment calls for. And so welcome to the panel, Esther. Thank you for joining us. Let us know, where are you in the world right now, if the temperature is acceptable, and kind of what your role is at the URJ.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm just going to correct the pronunciation of my last name. It's like David Lederman. So Lederman, like just think Dave Lederman. You know, we were in the leather business. That's like my ancestral roots. So I'm Rabbi Esther Lederman. Hi, everyone. I use she, her pronouns. I'm not far from Marty. I'm in Arlington, Virginia, where is very cold. Not as cold as Canada, where I grew up, but it's cold and trying to be toasty inside. And from this office that I am sitting in right now, I am the director of congregational innovation and leadership for the Union for Reform Judaism. My assumption is that most of you know what the Union for Reform Judaism is. You know, we're the largest and most diverse movement in North America, working with over 800 congregations in Canada and the United States. So I'm thrilled to be with all of you, and I'm eager to continue the conversation with all of you.
Great. So just, as you join as you join our crew here, we are very interested in both the technical know-how of organizations, but also in the bigger vision of the why behind some of these initiatives. So we're really willing to go into all different directions with this, and wherever the conversation is most fertile. But since I started with saying that you were a co-author on the multi-access article, let's start there. And where are congregations at imbibing in living that philosophy, whether they use the term or not? But where do you think congregations have gotten to? What bridges haven't yet been crossed but are waiting for us?
Right. Oh, great question. I mean, listen, COVID, obviously accelerated a lot of trends, I would argue, that was happening. And actually, although I wouldn't have been thinking about multi-access sort of pre-pandemic, I can share a little bit about how I think multi-access is impacting how congregations reimagine themselves for in the now and in the future. I mean, most congregations have sort of, whether they've lovingly accepted it or grudgingly accepted it, that whatever COVID has forced us to do in terms of playing with how Jewish content and Jewish experiences are delivered and experienced by the people we are called to be in community with, they're doing it, right? And I think the question really is, there were many places were already doing, the belovingly called live stream, getting to send the grandparents or the family members who couldn't come in and say, watch the service on the live stream. I would also argue that in some ways, I don't want to say exactly a return to the roots, but I'm always reminded when I talk about this that Emmanuel, the great, Temple Emmanuel of the city of New York on Fifth Avenue, used to pioneered, having their program be on the radio, right, on their evening service. And so, that was back in the day. So in some ways, this is both a going back and a moving forward. So most congregations have sort of said, this is here to stay. We're not going back to where we're going to be, or where we were. And I think what's interesting about, I'll just say the piece that I find most interesting about not just the term multi-access, but what it's meant to symbolize is, congregations are really a vessel for something bigger, right? They're a vessel that our ancestors created in reaction to, the destruction of a temple cult and a priesthood, to deliver Jewish living and content and wisdom and values. And I think this idea of multi-access is also allowing congregations to sort of reimagine what's the vessel for Judaism today. And so happy to get more into that, but that's where I'll stop there.
Yeah. Dave, I think your question that you put in the chat would be a great continuation of this. Do you want to articulate it?
Sure. I know, especially the Reform movement has been instrumental in live streaming services for many years, where other synagogues were more averse to having tech on Shabbat. But since then, or most of that has been one way, it's been broadcast. And really, since the pandemic, the opportunity and the need to have two-way has been there, and it seems to be an ongoing experiment. What's happening, from your perspective, Esther, on two-way communication, especially during services, if you want to have a remote davener or somebody coming up for an aliyah?
Right. Really interesting question. So thank you for clarifying, because I wasn't sure. I wanted to know what you meant by two-way, which I assumed meant from like the person who's at home to, what's going on inside the congregation.
Zoomers and rumors.
Yeah. So there are a lot of places that are doing it that way, right? Like that, they've set up a kind of scenario where they're leading from the bima, there's people in the sanctuary, and then you can see the Zoomers on the screen. And, I've seen many congregations do this well, where there's a way for the Zoomers to participate. And I do think that's interesting. But I also want to sort of emphasize, I think what else also has happened is recognizing that, and I'll sort of start with the story that I heard a lot. Delta happened, right? People started to come back, but were starting to come back in person. This is pre-Omicron. It's hard to keep track of the Greek alphabet out here. And people were starting slowly to open up, but people weren't rushing back to services in a way. I heard this a lot from clergy, like, we opened back up, but people really stayed on Zoom, or we thought there'd be people rushing to come back together. And a couple of things I wanted to lift up from that is, I said, on the one hand, it's worship Zooming in has been very convenient, which a lot of people would say, well, that's not good. And I would say, why is that not good? Right? Like, why is it terrible that we've made Judaism more accessible to more people? Like, I think we should be celebrating that. And also, I think this challenge of recognizing that people desperately wanted to be back in person, but it wasn't necessarily worship that they were desperate to come back for. Because if you think about the worship experience, I'll just use my own congregational experience, my own synagogue. If I was going to go back in person, the part that I was most missing was the conversation with my people. It wasn't, because I could access beautiful worship, I could listen to beautiful singing. But if I was going to sit in services for an hour and a half, mostly I was going to want to kibitz with people, which I did not necessarily want to sit and just watch passively a worship experience happen in front of me. Yes, I would be singing, but I missed the human context. So I think also this is a moment to also say, what does it mean to access Judaism in different ways than just the standard, we're going to learn Torah, we're going to worship together, we're going to do social justice together, to really reimagine, going to your comment, Dave, about two-way, that the experience of the person at the other end of the worship may be more experienced than the experience, maybe more important than the experience of the clergy, which I think is, for some people, very radical to think that is what we're trying to do here.
Can you say that line again? Can you say what
the experience of the human at the end of we're in synagogues trying to organize human beings, that their experience is actually more important than the need of the rabbi to make sure that we've done the Amida the way we need to do it, or have given the sermon that we need to do it. I mean, I'm a rabbi. I went into this business because I was called to be with people. But I think what COVID has done is challenged us to say, you can still be with people. You just might have to reimagine what being with people looks like. And also some of it may be on the online piece, like I have to be on Zoom, but also it may not be that the most important part of my day is no longer preparing for Friday night services. It might be the 50 one-on-one calls I make, or go drive around in my neighborhood to visit, which I think congregations were right. Like, it was timed for that kind of disruption. I wouldn't have wanted, millions of people dead in order for that disruption to happen. But I think we needed a disruption of what does it mean to connect with our people, and how do we as clergy then spend our time making sure that sacred community is happening. So I didn't exactly repeat what I said. I just went deeper.
Yeah, resonates a lot. David?
Yeah, that what you just said is so powerful, Rabbi, because I think that we have spent so much time focusing on how to get our services online, how to make our services multi-access, how to, and our services is where we see maybe 10%, maybe if we're lucky, of our community. What about all the time in between? What about all the ways in between that we have to reimagine our work as clergy? That's such a powerful idea.
Part of it's, listen, I feel like we should just call each other Rabbi. You can call me Esther. It's totally okay for you to call me Esther. Oh man, I'm having one of those moments where everything flies out of your head. I'll come back to it.
It's okay. I was just saying that how powerful it is to encourage rabbis, cantors, educators to think about multi-access outside of services when we only see a very small group of our people. Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up, Tobias? Is that okay? I'm curious. So tell me your title again.
Yeah. Director of Congregational Innovation and Leadership.
Right. So what did innovation mean in your title before the pandemic?
It meant working with congregational leaders, really top level. So not so much the rank and file, but people with positional authority, presidents, boards, rabbis, cantors, educators, mostly to bring them into relationship with one another so they could be brave to bring the kind of innovations that were necessary to move congregations forward. So I believe in innovation, not because we should all just be innovative, like innovation for the sake of innovation, but innovation because we know that generations are changing. We know that the congregations that we built in the 50s were not necessarily what the 80s needed, and what the 80s had is not necessarily what we need in 2022. So therefore, we need to sort of reimagine what it means to deliver spiritual connection. One of my colleagues used the term sort of, what's the new spiritual technology that we need to use? And so my job has really been about bringing people together for those conversations, because we're recognizing, part of my job is also to agitate within the system. I'll be honest, sometimes I agitate at the URJ, sometimes I agitate within the entire movement. That's sometimes what my job of my team is, and part of that is also asking, making sure we're asking the right questions. Because oftentimes what I find is that we're trying to solve for the wrong questions in congregational life. And so if we can spend, Einstein used to say something like, give me a problem, give me an hour to solve any problem. I'd spend the first 55 minutes making sure I'm asking the right question. And then I'd reserve the last 5 minutes to solve it. That we need to fall in love with the problems. We need to make sure we're asking the right questions. It does, you can come up with the best, most innovative, creative ideas that could move the needle. But if you don't have the relationships with political capital to make it happen, your ideas aren't going to go anywhere. And so trying to straddle that and recognizing that I can come up with brilliant ideas, but if there's no will and bravery to make it happen, doesn't matter how important the ideas are. So that's also something that, that informs this work now too. But that's a lot of what I've done.
I'm going to ask you about the bravery of the remote membership conversation from last week. But first, Marty, I saw your hand, so please jump in.
Yeah, so I love that the leadership of your congregation was bold enough to create a position like yours. I think that is so forward thinking for the survival of the congregation, for the movement of the congregation forward into the next number of years, and I think can only solidify the strength of the leadership in representing the congregation. I think that's marvelous, and now I understand what the innovation part of your title means. That's fabulous. I'm wondering what kind of an effect your congregation has seen on membership numbers, on giving, donations, on involvement and volunteerism during the pandemic.
So let me correct an assumption. I don't actually work for a congregation. I work for the umbrella of congregations. But I can still answer your question, and I'm just going to give you some best principles that I've seen at the 10,000 foot level, because we've seen a lot of different dynamics happening. I think the main piece that I want to emphasize is the congregational communities that have done a deep job on relational engagement, that sort of said, and this goes back actually to something the part that I wanted to remember, some places should go deep on creating amazing production value, right? Because they have the resources. We would all be shocked if Central Synagogue or Stephen Weiss didn't do a good job of producing amazing worship services, because they have the resources, they're big enough. But I think the other piece that I stress is, do you, if you're a 300 person congregation and that's not where your strength is, don't feel like you've got to be like the biggest, richest congregations in the country, get deep on what you're good at, which is the relational piece, and which is the real reason I think most people are belonging to a community. It's because they want those deep relationships. So Marty, to your question, the places that sort of said, who cares what worship looks like on a Friday night? We're going to do something on Zoom, but it's we're just going to be Hamish about it. We're going to be just sort of like folksy, but we're going to spend the rest of our staff time and lay leadership time visiting people, calling people, making sure they're taken care of. Those are the places that saw an increase in financial commitments, right? Those are the places that didn't see similar levels of attrition because they said, we got to stop. Because the other piece that we talk about in the innovation space is congregations are really good at adding new things to our plates and really terrible at stopping things. We're from a tradition, right? Like we love the past. So whatever we've done in the past must have been really amazing. And we should just keep doing it. No, that's not true. There are plenty of things we've done in the past that are past their time. So what are you going to stop doing to make space for this? And I think that was hard because congregations aren't used to having to stop things. But the places that did, and I think just went deep and recognized that the other big, I think, change that happened, and I think a lot of congregations realized this and are now rethinking the narrative that they tell, was the narrative for a lot of places was, well, don't we have an amazing building? It's got it's got history, it's got stained glass windows, it's been deemed, and I appreciate that. Like I love architecture, I love art, but the real assets in a congregation are its people. And I think that has become more and more obvious over these past 2 years. And I think the challenge became like, well, when we weren't meeting, people would be like, well, why would I pay? We're not in your glorious building that we've talked about for generations. And this need to sort of say, maybe we need to retell our story in a different way about who we are as a community.
That's great, Dave. Dave, I saw your hand come up if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I was thinking about when I log into B'nai Yeshurun to watch their events, it's clearly they have a bigger budget than we have, and yet you don't have to spend tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to get good results. In fact, after March, once we had to instruct everybody about how to use Zoom, our rabbi Hannah Dresner actually really embraced it and said, our presence on Zoom shouldn't just be in a dark room where you're kind of in the shadow. Bring yourself forward and make a mikdash me'at, a little kind of a sanctuary in your room. Think about the light and put some flowers in the side and wear, your Shabbat clothes, and so that when we look out at each other, we're seeing ourselves the way we love to come together, and not just be kind of in a dark room as an observer, stepping out and looking in.
I love that, Dave. Like, I think your rabbi and your community totally, that nails it. Because I think one of the pieces that, yes, Zoom is frustrating, but there's a level of intimacy that I would hear from people saying, I saw my rabbi in his kitchen. Like, I've never been in the rabbi's house before, and now I'm in the rabbi's house. Now, the rabbi may not love that everyone's seeing his or her kitchen, but I do think, I've done calls where we embrace, bring your pet, bring your child on screen, like let us see the intimacy of your home. And I think that's actually one of the benefits of Zoom, is we've been able to sort of connect to people in a way that we haven't really been in people's homes necessarily all the time. Yeah.
And kind of like my first point, we were kind of elevating to say, no, this is not a broadcast where you can sit back like you would watching TV. This is not Netflix. This is Zoom. And let's keep the interaction, the engagement that that we can accomplish with this technology in service of community.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of what you've been saying here is that only local institutions can do local. So the relationship stuff, the visiting people, the connecting with individuals, that's going to happen. That has potential to happen locally. We talked a little bit, we'll bring it in now, about synagogues that are starting to offer some level of remote membership, and how physical geography is not is not as much of a barrier to being part of a community as it used to be. But still, I think the smaller synagogues and the bigger synagogues embracing the localness of their situation is where it's at. So let's pivot there fully. So last week I was on I listened into a conversation that you hosted amongst 3 congregations that have started to offer some level of remote membership. And I thought what was really interesting about that conversation, which I'll let you do a broader intro of, was some of the ways people were asking the different questions and how differently that colored their perspective on it. So why don't you do a better job than I did? What was that conversation about?
Sure.
What insights came out?
Sure. So this was a call with rabbis, Paul Kipnis, who's at Oremy in Calabasas, California, just south of LA. Rabbi Sari Laufer, who's the chief engagement officer at Stephen Weiss in Los Angeles. And then Rabbi Nicole Auerbach, director of congregational engagement at Central Synagogue. So 2 very large congregations and one, sort of, I think 500, maybe 400 in Oremy. And so the reason why I brought them together was they're experimenting, sort of they're playing with this concept of digital online membership, this idea of people connected to people wanting to belong to these communities, but doing it in a way in which their physical presence is not demanded of them or not part of them. 2 of them have sort of geographic limitations. So both Stephen Weiss in LA and Oremy, their membership is open to, this type of membership is open to folks who don't live locally, and Central's is sort of open to anybody. I think the piece I want to, and so it was a conversation. The reason why we had this was because I get a lot of questions about it, and in no better way than just like what you do, organize people for a call and let's have these conversations. I think other congregations are curious about it because they're wondering if they have a market for it, if they should be trying this. I think some probably had an interest because there's a sense of, oh my God, if Central's doing this, is it going to eat up all my members? And I actually think that the messaging is actually really this is not to replace local affiliation, or if you have a local community, right? It's this idea again of the multi-access part. I know you mentioned that last week you had Sefaria, right? Sefaria has made equitable access to Jewish learning and text, right? You log on, you can find all these incredible text sheets and amazing stuff. COVID only did that even more rapidly, in which, you can access so much online, or you could act this idea of only accessing Judaism through one portal, your home congregation, is, I just don't think, when I think about, where we are now and where we're heading, I think that idea of accessing Judaism through lots of different portals is what's happening. And I understand the threat that brings to people, or the fear that brings to people, and also let it go, embrace it, right? And I'm not saying everyone should therefore embrace online membership, but what I'm saying is that this idea that people are going to access Judaism through multiple portals, they may be members of 2 places. They may make contributions to multiple Jewish institutions because of their love and belonging. And so anyway, so a lot of that is about also recognizing that, we're playing in a totally different game here now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm thinking back when I was young, I belonged to a Reform synagogue in New Jersey, but if I could have attended Wilderness Torah's Tu B'Shvat and been wow, there's an earth-based Judaism thing out there. It's based in California, but maybe we can add an aspect of that where I go. I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization that can happen from this process. That is a new thing for us.
Right. And I mean, I don't want to compare Judaism to any other, or religion to any other type of thing we access in our world. It's not the same as going to shop for groceries or buying clothing or those things. And if you think about how we consume other things or how we relate to other things, the news, grocery shopping. I mean, I go to 4 grocery stores because I like the tomatoes at this one, but better deals on, the fish at this one. And so this idea that you're gonna, we as people can't get everything answered in one place for everything. And I think it's also really hard, as we've talked about at the URJ. We also talk about how congregations are often made up of 5 generations, right? If you think about babies to, your 90-year-olds, it's really hard to be really good at all of that. That's why Sears went out of business. It's one of the reasons Sears went out of business. It's really hard to be everything to everyone. Mm-hmm. So you have to think about who are you going to be?
Sure. Definitely.
Could you talk a little bit about, I apologize, I had to jump off for a second. It was a crying child. Could you talk a little bit about how synagogues are adapting to this new model of being able to not have to do everything themselves, having to cooperate, having to work together? Synagogues are built, my understanding is that synagogues are built on membership, which means I need human beings to join my synagogue because I'm offering something unique and special they can't get somewhere else, and that's going to pay the bills. What happens to that when we are being intentional about sharing?
Right. It's a great question. I mean, I think I'm deep in that work right now with 33 congregations at the URJ, thinking deeply about, and starting with that question of is the membership model broken? And some would say, and I haven't made a definitive judgment on that personally. Like, I go back and forth between yes and having studied a little bit of the membership. There's a book called The Membership Economy, written by this incredible woman in Silicon Valley who studies things like Netflix and Amazon, and says, when I study the work that they're doing in the business world, I'm like, oh, it's not broken. It's just we're not doing it the way we should be. So I hear you. I mean, part of the way we talk about this, or the way is, well, first of all, right? One, we should imagine that membership in a congregation is not meant to be transactional, right? It's meant to be transformational. It's meant to be covenantal, and so therefore, how do we think of our people as our stakeholders and not our members? Or how do we think of people as investors? And I often say to a congregation when I'm doing this, when I'm having these kinds of conversations, how would people react differently, or how would they act differently if you called them a donor instead of a member? And there's this moment of should we call them donors? And I'm not saying you should put that on your website, but when you think about them as a donor or an investor, how might you, what would that change about how you operate as an institution, right? And how you interact with folks. And I'll also say that we are seeing incredible collaborations. I'll share a couple. There is a rabbi in Beverly Hills, I believe his name is Adam Lutz. He's been at Beverly Hills, Emmanuel. And him and 3 other congregations are collaborating on a religious school that involves both in person and online. And because they realized that it would be better to collaborate with one another than to, not so much that they were in competition with each other, but we're better together. Now, I think what's making it work is they have 3, it's a father-son involved. One of the rabbis at the other congregations is the father of Rabbi Adam Lutz, and they're in deep relationship with the other rabbi. So there's this idea of relationship building. We at the URJ are running our own pilot with congregations and Shalom Learning called Shalom Linked, in which congregations that needed an alternative for families who weren't ready to come back in person. So it was either you come back in person or we have nothing for you, and congregations couldn't manage this on their own. So we created a pilot for certain grades, hoping to expand it next year. And it was a really incredible answer for a lot of congregations, by pulling the resources of, both small and large congregations. So this wasn't just for the tinies, and say what is it? And that's the power to me of a movement. That's the benefit of when I, going back to Marty's question of why do we have my position and my team and the work that we do as a URJ is because there's a value in being in relationship. And my only wish is that I mean, those are just 2. There's a lot of other examples of collaboration. I think we need to learn to collaborate. And that might lead to, by the way, reimagining financial models.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
for the collaboration piece, when kind of how does this end up happening? I'm sure that there's multiple paths, but do you and your colleagues see that a congregation is doing something interesting that would be replicable or a potential for collaboration, and then you disseminate it? Or do people come to you and say, hey, I just did this thing, it would be so easy to partner with others on this? Kind of what are the mechanics? And if we catch someone listening who is doing something innovative, do they just get in touch with you to say, I think this could work for others? Or how does this work?
Yes, 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 and yes. Right. And I'm a big believer in organized mess. So some of the collaboration work or some of the work that we've done has been because like the Shalom Linked is a classic example of like, we're well positioned and we have a unique value in being able to do this. Sometimes we hear about a collaboration and then we use that we disseminate that learning to a broader audience. Like we bring those thinkers together and we say, isn't this a really interesting, model? Not because you're going to totally replicate the exact way they're doing it. So it's a real, it's a real mix of things, from either seeding things to supporting the work that we do see that's happening. One of the main ways of collaboration, we have a whole team, by the way, who works with congregations who are interested in making a more permanent collaboration, whether that's a merger, they call it a merger, or sometimes there's another term they've been using. And by the way, and that's not a sign of failure. To me, that's a sign of sort of putting smart heads together and saying, it makes sense for us to be in deeper relationship with each other. I just think collaboration is, especially, by the way, in 2019, we did some work, and I put out a report with others and talked about sort of future trends. And one of the things that we said to our congregational leaders was, you no longer own the ecosystem. That there is a whole ecosystem that's of Jewish life not happening in congregations. And so we need to get clear on that picture that the stuff that's happening outside of the congregational ecosystem is interesting stuff, right? Like what does a congregational partnership with Repair the World locally look like? Right? What does a congregational partnership with At the Well look like? We're doing a lot of this, and we're doing a lot of this also partnership, just like the Shalom Linked. With Shalom Learning, we have other partnerships. Like we have a whole partnership with the ADL right now on fighting anti-Semitism. Partnerships, I do think you need to be aware of your own self-interest, but I think that they're very powerful. And you can do that while still holding on to your institutional identity.
Yeah, it's really important that it's not saying I'm giving away this responsibility by collaborating, but really keeping yourself and your community active in that collaboration.
Yeah.
One question that Marty, was that a hand?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. So I'm a member of a Unitarian Universalist church, and I call myself a Jew. And within the Unitarians, they have formed collaborations between congregations that are, I could say that they're in close proximity geographically, but it really doesn't matter. And they are sharing worship elements, sermons, youth stories, music, etc., that they can use within their own services. But then they also form social justice partnerships with outside organizations. And so they have partnerships within, between you congregations, and there's the Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters but there are also partnerships between UU congregations and, say, mosques and other faiths for the purposes of interfaith understanding and community and social justice and et cetera. And that works really well because people go out and they actually have meetings, and they talk to each other and meet with each other, and that's very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I know that goes on for sure in our movement pre-pandemic. I mean, just the Facebook pages that our professionals use to share those things. Your comment also reminded me of, like one of the innovations or one of the new ways of thinking about things in the pandemic that we've encouraged people to think about. I think some people have, particularly in smaller places where you're the only rabbi, right? And it's a big burden. I mean, it's also a privilege, but people are burnt out. Our clergy are burnt out. Our staff, our educators are burnt out. So one of the things that we had said was, in a world of Zoom in which we're not praying in person, the rabbi in Springfield, Illinois, and I'm just making up places here, but like, if you want a Friday off, tell your community to go pray with this community. Right. And I think the question is, are you willing to let go of the fear that like, oh my God, they're going to see something they like and it's better there. But oh my God, but what a gift, right? What a gift. Like, and I'll do it for you next week. And then you can have Friday night off. And wouldn't it be interesting if we had a rotation, particularly also if we're already somewhat geographically close, like maybe we're all in the same state. So maybe in real time, we could actually see each other in person. And wouldn't that be interesting? We have to be, there's we talk about the difference between a mindset of abundance and a mindset of scarcity. Mm-hmm. The mindset of abundance is what's going to help us here. And the scarcity mindset is not going to, we're just going to box ourselves further in and further down. And I just want to say, I can't write in the chat. So if anyone's upset, like I'm not responding to anything in the chat, it's because my keyboard's not working. So just for the panelists and for the participants,
Well, we'll circle back to some of the questions that have come in the chat. And if anything's coming directly to you, that's good to know that you won't be getting...
Nothing's coming directly to me, but I mean, talking about multi-access, I can't even type right now. So...
Dave, your hand popped up about congregational collaboration, I think.
Yeah, so that was very inspiring. Certainly, the seeing abundance rather than scarcity is a blessing, and it's one we wrestle with because we encourage people to be members because we have a building, we have a rabbi, we have fixed costs, and so the membership is a commitment to keeping that institution going. But really, since the pandemic, we've also been able to embrace there's this fantastic program that's going here. There's a Beit Midrash going on here. Go explore, and that's the distinction for us between membership and donor. Donor is kind of like I support this initiative. I really love what you're doing. I can't. I'm not in it, but I'm of it. And for our part, we found that people have been very generous because their travel budget can't be used, and going out for dinner isn't being used as much in concerts. So we actually had an initiative where we said, "Hey, take some of that money, give it to tzedakah, maybe raise your donation to whatever." So that I'm really inspired by that idea of abundance, where we can share and we can encourage people to go outside just the services that we can provide because they come home to them and love them, and they've also bring in exploration and ideas from outside. So it's really quite a wonderful time for that exploration.
Dave, can you elaborate a little bit there? Like how has the clergy or yourself, how have you communicated to congregants, we want to be home base and we want you to explore these other things? Have you sent has there been an opportunity for a bunch of you to all go to something together put on by another organization? Or has it just been, these are things that are going on?
Well, they kind of came up organically through the listserv of the congregation of people saying, "Oh, I heard there's a Friday night service on the days that we don't offer Friday night service. You might want to go to this one." So we kind of had if you're not conflicting with honor events, gay gesint, go and encourage people to try something else that you may have found and you can advocate for. And we've actually embraced that now into our weekly newsletter, where the programs that are encouraged by either staff people, by a rabbi, or been advocated by a kahal within the kahal, maybe a chevra inside, can be advertised in our weekly newsletter with the rule that we try to avoid creating competing services or competing events. But there's so many days that are open and events that we can't do ourselves, that there's lots of openings for encouraging people to attend other things. So we found a kind of a nice balance between not being overly protective, but being embracing of membership and of encouragement of exploration.
Wonderful. I know that David stepped away, but I want to advocate for his question, since we do call ourselves the Synagogue Tech Forum. And so he posed the question, what are some of the essential tools or technologies that you, Esther, have seen in the field helping communities to thrive in this new world? And so that could be Salesforce-y type things, or synagogue live stream type things, or some other type things that you've seen are making possible some pushes forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to start with, I'm trying to think about what I should start with. I'm going to start with something that's so obvious, but it wasn't actually 2 years ago. So, it's kind of crazy, but the URJ had been using Zoom for 3 years prior to, or 2 years prior to the pandemic, because we're already a multi-access institution. My whole team, none of us works in our headquarters in New York. So for the first 2 months, I basically taught people how to use Zoom. And I want to say something about Zoom in particular, not because it was so great from a streaming worship perspective, but it allowed, so one of the initiatives that we've been working on is understanding that the thickening of relationships between people in a community is the most important thing of keeping people together. And so all the small group work that we had been doing moved to Zoom. So Zoom, I do think, I'm sure there's other competitors out there in the field, but Zoom has been essential. Like I don't know what people would do without Zoom. I know related to that, like one of the other technologies people have introduced or spoken to me of is the owl. Therefore allowing sort of that hybrid experience of, there's people here and there's people out there, and they're going to be able to have the same experience. The people that have been adopting the use of the owl, I'm sure.
That owl use case, which we've experimented with a bit at Temple Israel, is also, it's like works really well for the small group.
Yeah.
And it reaches a limit in terms of how many people it can incorporate. Right. So it really fits well with the small group emphasis, which is also, regardless of pandemic or technology needs, like you said, the URJ was focusing on within your congregation, you need to strengthen subgroups. So that makes sense.
So just some other, these are, some of these are going to sound sort of ridiculous, but they're not. And because it's about going back to something that's old. The phone. Like, I think also because of the ubiquitousness of Zoom, like this idea of calling someone on the telephone and actually having a conversation where you can focus on just that, like there's not all that other input. I also want to, I brought a prop. So this is my congregation's member directory. I'm a member of Temple Micah in Washington, D.C., my beloved home. I always have it here because if I'm writing condolence notes, I'm mailing people things. I remember the mail. I don't know if many people remember what the cost of a postage stamp is these days, but I used it recently because I had taken a walk with a friend and I had recommended anti-fogging wipes. And also I wanted to lend her a book that she hadn't yet bought. And I said, I'll go. So I took my directory. What does this have to do with this? Is I had a moment in looking at this and I was like, part of me in looking at this directory said, and there are some places who did this. Like, I think if I had had the agency, I would have been like, okay, who are the 10 people I'm going to visit this week? And I'm just going to pull out the most beautiful thing about my directory is we have zip codes. I don't want to hold it too close because I don't want to have to show you names, but like I can see who lives in my zip code. And we're one of these congregations where we used to have a bumper sticker that said Temple Micah, it's worth the schlep, because we're not a communal, people come in from Annapolis, Bethesda, Rockville, Virginia, DC, we're from all over. So this relates back to this idea of Salesforce and data. I don't know how you operate without a customer relationship software in your system. And if I know David posted the link to the membership economy, we have got to get good on our data of who our people are and where, and not just where they live. Where they live is important, but other things about them. I think understanding the mapping of who's in your community and also who's connected to who, I think is essential in this moment. And I learned that from, that's when I had that moment of membership works. We're just doing it really badly because and there are places that are doing it well. But, how much is congregational staff spending on understanding the data, making sure the data is up to date, understanding who's in relationship with who, and in terms of, I think that's really important when it comes to retention and recruitment or engaging new people. But I think it's really important when it comes to retention, because I hear many congregations have the same story of we're losing people post B'nai Mitzvah, or we're losing people when the last kid goes to college. And the question is well, how much engagement have you done and how much paying attention have you done? So anyway, those are, I realize it wasn't all the fancy. I'm sure there's other technology our congregations have used well. I'm happy to recommend other congregations that I think are doing this well. My joke, I think I said to Tobias earlier, was I might talk about multi-access, but I'm still I'm the person sitting taking notes on a piece of paper with a pen, because I'm still the person who buys books and doesn't read them online. So I'm sort of old school in that way.
David,
you just made me think about because you mentioned Sapphire earlier, you just made me think about the visualizations of connections that they do, right? So these are all the connections between the Talmud and Tanakh. We looked at this a little bit last week.
Wow.
But so here you can see how 1 Samuel is related to all those other texts. And I'm just imagining doing this in a community, so that, X person has a connection to this person over here because of Y and this, and being able to visualize those connections and then choosing what our next program, what our next offering, what our next celebration is going to be based on, or at the very least as an outgrowth of what we learn from all those connections. What powerful information to have that we, one of the technologies that we have now is the capacity to see who's participating in our services. Where are they from? What gender are they? What are some of their interests? We can look at all of that. And I know that wigs some people out. It's Big Brother, but using that data to understand those connections is really, really important, I think.
Yeah.
I'm so glad.
And if our online shoe retailer knows all that information about us, then shouldn't the congregation also know some of that stuff and utilize it to make those connections? We've been dealing with this problem this week. We're talking about it because of the pandemic. We've made religious school classes smaller, had 2 different time sessions, but now people who go to the same public school don't bump into each other if they ended up in the opposite time frame. And so then now we're thinking as a staff, how can we take responsibility for that and make sure that people who do go to the same school don't realize they're part of the same temple yet? How do we thicken that thread when it's not happening as organically with less in-person opportunities, fewer in-person opportunities? The other side of technology and tools is the people that use them and wield them. And so I'm wondering what you've seen. We have this panel for us gives us a slice of, sometimes it's the rabbi, sometimes it's the rabbi educator, sometimes it's the lay leader, sometimes it's the technologist. like, who are you seeing implement innovations of this kind in terms of on a staff? And likewise, like I mentioned this to Marty once, and I didn't move forward on it, but there must be some like beautiful new job description of who every synagogue needs, that can take some of these technology burdens away from the clergy, knows this stuff better than the average facilities person. Like, what is the human skills that we need, and who can fulfill them for congregations?
This is a really interesting question. First of all, everyone. I mean, like, I think it depends on the system, right? Like, in some ways, some of the most innovative people in the system have been the educators when it comes to, like, not the part about getting online, like whether you're using the Neat Bar, like the streaming, but like Jamboard, Miro, Padlet, Mentimeter, like just like some of those, like, oh, you mean we don't just have to stare and look at each other, we can also do other fun things. So a lot of that has been the educator, but in terms of the other pieces, particularly around production, I mean, it's everybody. I've seen rabbis turn their home studies or like their basements into like production studios. I mean, I just see David Paskin sitting there with like, a whole, sometimes it's the rabbi, sometimes it's the cantor, sometimes there's, very, capable lay leaders. I mean, depending on the size, we have communications directors. In terms of like I'm sure that there are new job descriptions out there, like video tech coordinator, but I think more broadly than just this slice, I think this pandemic, like we have a group of people thinking about how do we work differently now in congregations, thinking about everything from like, well, do we need everyone in the building at the same time 5 days a week, right? Like what are the job requirements? What does a synagogue today need? What kind of volunteer engagement positions do we need? What kind of jobs do we need? And what's the technology we use to be meeting together? Do we all need to be in the building at the same time? I mean, I think there's been, some people have been sort of taken a very creative path to this. I think some people have said like, let's just go back. There's some places that are like, we just want to go back to the way it was. And I think that's just not happening. And I also think it's just sort of here's what I'll say about the technology piece and the jobs. So Danny Meyer, the founder of Shake Shack and a lot of other incredible restaurants in New York City and elsewhere, wrote a book. I'm blanking on the name of the book, but just Google it or look in Amazon or no, it's not Resetting the Table, but he wrote this incredible chapter. It's an incredible book just about hospitality in general and how we treat people. But he talked about sort of the hiring for soft skills versus hard skills. And he always hires for the soft skills. But like any job that requires, you need to learn a technology, you need to learn how to use a device, we can teach that to you. What we can't necessarily teach to you is your resilience, your adaptability, your flexibility, your ability to be relational. And so therefore hire for those things. And I think that's the thing that goes through my head is how adaptable is our staff, right? I mean, I think we've seen a lot of incredible adaptability. As I heard one rabbi say to his staff when the pandemic hit, like, pack a box, take everything you're going to need to do for your work at home, and also throw out your job descriptions because they're now obsolete. And I think the places that are doing that will be the healthier congregations, the places that thrive more, and also I think will help their people thrive. Like, I mean, I also think there's a big question about listening to your employees in terms of
that has to be part of that.
Yeah.
Because it needs to be a mutual rewriting of the job description, and since even the delegators, we don't know how much planning goes into these totally new functions. So there's not a feedback loop of, I'm happy that I'm now the Zoom operator, but actually I need to log on 45 minutes before to make sure that this and this and this and this. So there's got to be a collaborative rewriting.
Amen.
Dave, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a quick one, which was we recently hired a new person, and in their interview they said, "I don't mind if you don't hire me, but please make sure you hire a millennial," because hiring for the job ideal, the technology comes with that generation. His feeling was, and it's working out pretty well.
Some controversy in that opinion, but it's in broad strokes it can be effective. So we're just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to just open it to you. Is there something you want to ask from us as a group? If there's any subtopic that kind of came up that or any problem that you're still thinking through in an early stage, and either just to make us aware of it, or if we can jump in any helpful way.
It's a great question.
Did you, Tobias, did you ask her about the neat bar?
Oh, I saw that.
I didn't.
David.
I didn't get that in there. No.
Still promoting it. I think we have it. Like, I'm the worst person to ask.
Okay.
I'm not saying
it's not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing. I just
we have
really
been
expensive.
Yes, I don't like. This is where you're like, oh my, like I keep like there are times when you're asking questions and I'm like, Larry Glickman should have been on this call. Like we have we have somebody on our team, like generally URJ team, who's working on all of those kinds of like Zoom offerings on Zoom. Insperity was one we had recently. Can't answer that one for you. I'm sorry. I guess, I'm curious. You're all from different, you're all in different places. You're all from different, Reform. David, I don't know what your background is. Dave Kaufman, I understand, is a renewal lay leader. Marty, you're at JU. Love that. I guess, like, what's the overall lesson you've learned? You've been doing these conversations. I hope I'm not the only woman who's ever been on a call, by the way. I pay a lot of attention to identities, and I'm just very aware, like I'm not used to being in a space where it's like 4 men and 1 woman. So I hope that there are other women who've joined you as panelists. But what's like, if you could sum up, a lesson you've been taken from these conversations, what would it be? And what do you think? I think, because I'm hoping there are some congregational leaders who are participating. What would you tell them? That's what I'd like to know.
Who will jump? Marty? Yeah.
Well, having talked with many people from many different types of congregations in all different places in the country and abroad, what I have found pretty spectacular is the transformation that everybody, with varying degrees of success, made from never having webcast, even audio, to doing pretty respectable audio and video webcasting, whether it be all virtual or simulcasting, live services from the sanctuary. And I've also found it quite remarkable the sharing and collaboration that occurred between all the congregations, between the house of worship community in general, to help each other explore and suss out all these different technologies and types and methodologies and strategies for what can work for each one. I think that's been pretty remarkable. And just going back to something that was talked about earlier, you said something that I completely agree with, and that it's, you said the experience of the at-home congregant is more important than the experience of the clergy, and it's all about community, and it's all about giving people an opportunity to engage with each other, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And in some ways that's more important than the technology. But we would also at the same time be remiss to lead people to believe that quality is not important. at least a minimum amount of quality for your audio and your picture is really important, because without you can have audio without picture, and we do that every day when we drive in our cars, but you can't have picture without audio, and you want, and we're very so visually oriented that we need to have something in front of us that is at a minimum acceptable, viewable, attractive, and engaging to help bring us into the experience.
Thank you.
Dave?
It's a tremendous opportunity in every paradigm shift. Our teacher, B'nai Lappe from Svara, talks about when there's a break in a paradigm, there's a tremendous freedom. And then eventually people can't handle uncertainty for long, and it collapses. And does it collapse into what used to be, or does it reform itself into something new? And I think this is really why I'm on this panel. It's so exciting, is because we're in this place where we're still innovating and exploring, and people are far more receptive to changes and to adoption of technology in service of community than they were before the pandemic. And that's an opportunity that we have before it starts to congeal and collapse again into this new thing, is to expand those capabilities. And the technology for me always has to be in service of community, in service of the spiritual. And so we don't want to hire a tech person. We want to hire somebody who wants to raise the sparks of spiritual community and community engagement. And here's all the technology stuff that I can bring in, many people can bring in order to facilitate that. So it's an exciting time.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, that just blew my mind a little bit. That teaching, right, about what could happen, I want to get that. We should have that teacher on here, because Marty is right. Audio is important, video is important, all of that is important. And as a spiritual group and show, there are also those bigger questions of what are we going to do with this moment? And the way you just laid it out was just really striking to me. So I don't know if you want to reach out to that teacher, but I would love to learn from him or her.
Sure, we'll do.
I'll just add, if it's okay, and then I'll stop talking to Tobias, that Esther, that I've been working with a lot of synagogues around the country, and in fact, we had people from URJ we had a summit this summer. I'm a little surprised at how many communities are still feel that they're at stage one. Still have very basic questions. I don't think that, I think that I'm glad that we have been pushed into this space and have to broaden our experiences. I'm sad that it happened the way it did, not only, of course, for the obvious reasons, but also because I think so many of us moved so quickly that, first of all, we couldn't do it thoughtfully. We just had to get our services online. And second of all, we couldn't do it in such a way that we took the time to actually learn what we were doing and how to do it simply and well and all those other pieces. And so I'm looking forward to the opportunity, whenever that comes, for us to do this well. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is I'm not suggesting that anyone isn't doing it well, but in such a way that we can be reflective, that we can be thoughtful about the choices that we're making, and when it isn't just about budget lines, when it's about how is this, and I think, Dave, you said this before, the technology needs to serve the purpose of building a community. Right, Na'aseh v'nishma, Dave is saying, right? We did it, and then we listened. I would like to flip that a little bit. I'd like us to have the opportunity to be more reflective and to make choices around technology, around applications, around the way that we choose to do things that really do serve our communities. Excuse me. Sorry, Tobias.
Yeah. I think for me, it's been internalizing that we took for granted that a building had to be in great shape. They weren't always, but we took for granted that you need to have running water in the building, the lights need to be on. And there was a ton of work and money into that and personnel, but everything else couldn't happen without that fundamental layer. And we're building a new fundamental layer of how do we architect our gatherings in a multi-access way online. And so it's like that level, right? If there's a pipe burst, everything else in the building is secondary. Like the pipe burst is what matters in that moment. And this connection I've been thinking about this connection to another thing in the portion of the ox goring another ox or goring a person, and how if it happens the first time for this ox that they gore someone, the owner is not so responsible. They have to pay some damages, but it doesn't fall onto the owner to be punished directly. But if you know that you have a goring ox and they gore someone, then the punishment does go to the human owner. And it's the same thing with kind of failing multi-access. If you did it once and you didn't realize you were doing it, it's not such a devastating part of the system. But once you're made aware of it and you know you have this responsibility and you still let it down, then why would, like, patients should run out from congregants or from potential congregants that you're not building this access for me. And as a rabbi and as an institution, you are responsible for all the pathways in. So it's just been a kind of taking a really active responsibility for building this new layer. And that's what inspires me to remain part of these conversations, because I don't want to miss a new tool, a new way of thinking that will prevent any ox gorings in the community.
That would be ox gorings. That's a big no.
Yeah,
hard stop on the ox gorings. Yeah.
So I think we are going to end the show now. So thank you so much, Rabbi Esther Lederman. You've been the work that you do day in, day out, and then the way you can communicate it to us through your different blog articles and through joining the show really means a lot to us. So thank you for joining, and we're going to thank you. So we're going to stop the live stream, but Marty, David, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to ask Marty, you have a show coming up next week?
We do have a show coming up next week. The topic hasn't been finalized yet, but it's Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time.
Fantastic.
Look at the Discord, look at the Hybrid Ministries Tech Forum YouTube page and Facebook group.
Awesome.
And also for anyone who's listened this far, if you post questions after the fact, we would love to address them in our next show. So we'll take questions in our comments anytime and try to answer them as a group. So with that, thank you so much for listening and contributing.